Hey everybody, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going over this piece of news here that just came out this morning about Volta and SHEL entering into an agreement where SHEL is going to acquire all of the shares of Volta at a price of 86 cents per share. Volta put out this article about this today. They start off by saying that Volta today announced the execution of a definitive merger agreement under which SHEL USA Incorporated, a subsidiary of SHEL plc, will acquire Volta in an all-cash transaction valued at approximately $169 million. The transaction brings Volta's powerful dual charging and media network to SHEL's established brand and seeks to unlock robust, long-term growth opportunities in electric vehicle charging. Now what will probably happen is SHEL is going to bring Volta underneath their SHEL Recharge brand. Of course, they do have the choice to go ahead and keep Volta as this separate brand, but I imagine eventually they will end up being rebranded as SHEL Recharge stations. They say both Volta and SHEL have a demonstrated ability to meet the charging needs of customers, and this acquisition will bring that experience together to provide the options that are needed as more drivers choose electric. Under the terms of the merger agreement, SHEL USA Incorporated will acquire all of the outstanding shares of Class A common stock of Volta at 86 cents per share in cash upon completion of the merger, which represents an approximate 18% premium to the closing price of Volta stock on January 17, 2023, which was yesterday, the last full day of trading prior to the announcement of the transaction. So notice 86 cents per share and 18 cents premium from yesterday. That's exactly what we're seeing in the stock today. The stock right now, it's at 86 cents per share. Sometimes it's been going a little over it. We can see way over here in the morning it was at 87 cents per share. But yeah, basically right now at the moment it's actually almost a 19% gain from yesterday. But you know, we've seen the stock being completely flat for the most part today. That's because, you know, this is pretty much the price that it looks like SHEL is going to be acquiring Volta for. Vince Cubbage, the interim chief executive officer, said the shift to e-mobility is unstoppable, and SHEL recognizes Volta's industry-leading dual charging and media model delivers a public charging offering that is affordable, reliable, and accessible. While the EV infrastructure market opportunity is potentially enormous, Volta's ability to capture it independently in challenging market conditions and with ongoing capital constraints was limited. This transaction creates value for our shareholders and provides our exceptional employees and other stakeholders a clear path forward. This next quote here is literally just a repeat of this quote up above. Then we've got, this acquisition builds on the momentum in electric mobility by combining one of the leading EV charging and media companies in the US with one of the world's largest energy suppliers. The transaction provides the opportunity to unlock Volta's significant signed pipeline of charging stalls in construction or evaluation and capture the seismic EV charging market opportunity. Following the completion of the transaction, there will be no immediate change in driver experience, Volta Media Network capabilities available to advertisers, or services provided to commercial properties in retail locations. Now, the keyword here is immediate. So, you know, immediately after the transaction happens, there's not going to be a very noticeable difference with, you know, Volta's products and services, but this could change at some point in the future. As part of the agreement, an affiliate of SHEL will provide subordinated secure term loans to Volta to bridge Volta through the closing of the transaction, which is really awesome to see. At the moment, Volta really has next to no cash remaining. As of September 30th last year, they only had $15.6 million. Meanwhile, a lot of their, you know, the salaries that they were paying here under the selling general and administrative line on their income statement, you can see was a bit over $40 million. Now, some of that was stock-based compensation, but still, this is a staggering amount compared to, you know, the amount of cash that they have. So they would have had to have been laying off a lot of employees, I imagine, down to probably next to nothing if they didn't end up getting these loans from SHEL to bridge them until the transaction closes. Volta's board of directors, having determined the transaction is in the best interest of the company's stockholders, has unanimously approved the transaction and recommends that Volta stockholders approve the transaction and adopt the merger agreement at the special meeting of stockholders to be called in connection with the transaction. The transaction is expected to close in the first half of this year. The closing of the merger is subject to the approval of Volta stockholders, the expiration or termination of the waiting period under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act, and other applicable regulatory approvals and other customary closing conditions. Upon closing of the transaction, Volta's Class A common stock will no longer be listed on any public market. So that pretty much covers everything in this article here. I'd like to again point out that SHEL is going to be acquiring Volta for 86 cents per share. right now in the stock over the past half an hour has been kind of going up over that 86 cents per share, and I'm not totally sure why that is. Right now they're at 87.5 cents per share. So, I'm not totally sure why it's going above this acquisition price, but it doesn't seem like there's really much upside left to holding Volta stock at this point in time. Now, if you do decide to hold Volta until this transaction goes through, which again is supposed to be happening in the first half of this year, chances are your shares are going to be automatically sold at the time of the transaction. Maybe there's a chance that you'll be able to carry over and own shares of SHEL, perhaps. But if your shares are just sold, then it would simply be at that 86 cents per share price that SHEL is acquiring Volta for. Now, we can only speculate what SHEL has planned for Volta once the acquisition goes through, but again, I'd say chances are at some point they're going to rebrand all of these Volta chargers over to SHEL Recharge charging stations. Now, beyond that, I think the other things SHEL would do would be the things that Volta was planning on doing before they started getting really constrained by the amount of cash they had. The first of those was to start taking payments to charge at all of their charging stations. So a lot of people know that Volta's level 2 charging stations are free, and I believe for a while their DC fast charging stations also were free, but last year they had announced that they planned to roll out charging to charge for all of their charging stations, starting with the DC fast charging stations. And as far as I know, a lot of Volta's DC fast charging stations do require a payment by this time, but their level 2 stations required a retrofit to install a payment processing device on them, essentially. So they weren't really able to pull that off with the lack of cash that they had. So I would expect Volta stations to no longer be free, and instead require payments for all of them, including the level 2 stations that are currently free today. I think this is the best path forward for this sort of model that Volta has used. I know it sounds good for these stations to be free to charge at, but it just doesn't really make sense in the long run. Because these stations are currently free to charge at, there's really no reason not to go ahead and charge there if you've got an EV. So even if you have an EV and you live in the area and you really don't need to charge at all, you'll still use this, because why wouldn't you? The only reason not to would be if you were just trying to be courteous and not take up the charging stall. But of course, you can't just stop that from happening. So there's going to be people that go ahead and take up that charging stall and prevent other people who actually need to charge more from using this charger. So it only makes sense to require payments to prevent people who really don't need to be charging there at all, to prevent them from using that charger and basically blocking that stall from another person who actually needs to charge there from using it. Now, of course, the media screens on Volta's chargers already bring in a lot of revenue, so this would, of course, be even more revenue for Volta. Already with these screens alone, Volta said that they had the highest revenue per charger in the entire industry. So obviously this is a pretty good business model to be using. The only problem with that model was that it was much more capital intensive than, building out chargers that don't have these big screens on them. Now, another advantage to requiring payments with their chargers is that they can more easily and reasonably scale the chargers in the parking lot, because at the moment, the basic philosophy here is that the screen pays for the charging, essentially. This is the revenue stream for the charger, because the charging is free. But if you were basically, it maxes out here, because you can only have really one charging station here using that model, because if you put another charger right next to it, then you've got another screen basically. Just imagine like a row of 5, 6, 10 of these chargers, and there's just 10 screens in a row. How much there's diminishing returns to just having a bunch of screens like that. So it makes sense to have a screen here, and you can see that there's another one back here in this photo that they've got. So it makes sense to spread them out here like this along the front. But then if you want to add more chargers, it doesn't really make any sense to add more that have a screen. It makes sense to add more stalls that don't have a screen. For example, if we take a look at this image over here, we can see two stations right next to each other, and sure, you can run different ads on both of these screens, but there's diminishing returns again to just having a bunch of screens right next to each other like this. And Volta already makes chargers that don't have screens. They've got these towers, and you can see them in some of their promotional images, and I believe they do have sites out there already. just using these towers. Basically right now, as far as their current model involving these free chargers goes, the screen is what makes all of the revenue, and these chargers are just adding costs. They're not making any money for Volta at all. But again, I've said it a lot in this video, it just makes sense to begin taking payments for the charging. It just makes these a lot more feasible to build out. Now, even in the scenario that payment is required to charge, there still are those screens bringing in a lot of revenue. So they can probably use the revenue coming in from those screens to kind of offset some of those costs with the charging and be able to price their charging a bit lower than some of their competitors that don't have this screen bringing in a lot of extra revenue. And this can go the other way around as well for advertisers, because again, Volta is just as much an advertising company as a charging company, essentially. You know, they can use the revenue that they will eventually bring in from the charging to go ahead and sort of offset those costs associated with the advertising and be able to charge advertisers a lower price for running advertisements on their screens compared to other advertising companies. Now, I don't think these sort of lower prices for charging or advertising would necessarily be anything crazy significant necessarily, but you know, these are just some options that SHEL is going to have when it comes to the pricing of the advertisements and then eventually the charging, most likely. Now, there's going to be some scenarios where advertising in an area is really not effective, so they can just use these towers so they don't have to build all of their chargers with these screens that just don't really do anything for them and just add a bunch of costs. And that can go the other way as well. There might be circumstances where it's really effective to advertise, but there's really no need to charge. You know, for example, if it's like the middle of a shopping mall or something, and there's no parking spaces in there, they can have an advertising screen just without the charger. So that's another piece of hardware they could add to their lineup, would be just a dedicated advertising screen without any of the charging components. Now, one last thing that I was confused about while I was reading this, that I just remembered, is that it says that SHEL will acquire Volta in an all-cash transaction valued at approximately $169 million. I'm not totally sure. If somebody knows anything about like why this is different than that 86 cents per share price, because at 86 cents per share, the valuation is about $150 million. So I'm not totally sure why this says 169 million. So if anybody knows anything about that, please go ahead and drop a comment down there. But that's pretty much everything about this SHEL and Volta acquisition and all of my thoughts on what SHEL might end up doing. So I hope everybody enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in the next video.